Okay, guys, good evening. Let's go ahead and get started for tonight. Okay, so tonight we're going to do chapter 15 in your textbook. Okay, and this is our last new chapter, so this is the last piece of new information I guess you have to learn for the semester, at least for this class. Okay, so today, just to go over the kind of the rest of the schedule, today's the May 11th, and so we'll do the last chapter, chapter 15 tonight. Okay, next Monday, May 18th, we'll do the review for the final exam, and I'll distribute or pass out or post the final on Blackboard at the time. Okay, so tonight, chapter 15, next time, mid-final review. Okay, and remember I changed the deadline or extended the deadline for the homeworks, which are now due the Wednesday before, so Wednesday, May 20th, right? Okay, so that's the last day that you can submit any homework assignments because I'm going to post the solutions on that day, and then your finals due Monday, May 25th, like it says in the syllabus. And so we have 3 more meetings, but the last one is really just, I'm not going to do any new material, but I'll be here on Monday, May 25th in case you have any questions about the final or anything else. And so I'll hold the last WebEx session during finals, but we're not going to do any new material, obviously, because that's the day the finals due. Okay, so if there's no questions about anything, let's go ahead and start chapter 15. Okay, so we'll talk about interest rates and then close up with monetary policy. Okay, so you can go to the study guides, which are updated on the 8th, and go to the chapter 15 stuff. Right, and you can open up to chapter 15 with notes and solutions. Okay, and then you can also go to the PowerPoint and open up our very last, the last one, chapter 15. Okay. So let's start by just introducing monetary policy, because this is really our last big topic. We talked about some macroeconomic topics and fiscal policy. And so now we've been building up to, we did some kind of financial econ and money and banking last week, including the recent financial crisis. And today we'll finish up with talking about how the Federal Reserve can use some of the policy tools to influence the economy. All right, so first let's just introduce monetary policy. And so I think I put a little definition down here in this document. Okay, so just to introduce what is monetary policy. So monetary policy is the demand side of economic policy, and these are actions undertaken by the nation's central bank, which in our case is the Federal Reserve. Okay, in order to control the money supply, and by doing that, they want to achieve some macroeconomic goals, whether that's to speed up the economy, fight unemployment, or maybe prevent inflation. So the Federal Reserve has a bunch of policy tools that we'll talk about coming up, in which they can indirectly control the money supply, and that has huge effects on the economy if they're able to successfully use their tools. All right, so that's what we'll kind of be talking about today, and again, let's move on to the PowerPoint section. Okay, so let's introduce interest rates on slides 2 to 3, because these are how the Fed indirectly affects the money supply is by targeting specific interest rates. So let's just briefly introduce what we mean by interest rates in this concept. All right, slides 2 to 3. Okay, so interest rates, and there's different ones, but just in general, this is the price paid for the use of money. All right, so if you want to borrow money, you're subject to a specific interest rate depending on what the goal is. If you're taking out any loan or borrowing it for any reason, you have to worry about the interest rate that comes with it. All right, so there's many different interest rates, but when we look at this big macro model, we'll just kind of assume that we're just talking about interest rates. And so we're talking about kind of interest rates in general, so we'll speak of one interest rate, but just know that they kind of move together. Right, so there's different levels depending on the type of market and the risk factor. But when interest rates go up, then they go up kind of all together, and if they go down, they all go down. So we just say interest rates, but that applies to all the interest rates in the economy. Okay, as we'll see, this is determined by the money market, which is money supply and money demand. So we'll look at that graph in a couple minutes. Let's look at, on the next slide, this has a bunch of different interest rates. Okay, and so what we're saying is, so the interest rate the Federal Reserve targets is that federal funds rate, which we'll talk about more, but by targeting that, they're able to have an effect on the rest of the interest rates. So some interest rates are higher and some are lower, but they all move in accordance with the federal funds rate. So when the Fed targets that, that has a effect on the other interest rates that businesses and banks charge to their customers. All right, so there's different types of interest rates, including the ones here. There's a 20-year Treasury bond rate, so that means this is pretty much risk-free. If you loan your money to the federal government and wait 20 years, you get a nice 2.8% interest. Okay, if you wait 3 months, you get 0.5%. So again, these are not very high returns, but they're pretty much risk-free because the federal government always pays its best. Okay, the prime interest rate right here is, this moves along with the federal funds rate. So this is the rate kind of a reference rate for a wide range of bank loans. All right, so average mortgage rates were something like 4% in 2017, so those are a little bit higher. Automobile loans are about 4%. Savings bonds are pretty low because those are really risk-free. And this is the federal funds rate, which is pretty low. And so we'll look at this some more because, again, this is the rate the Fed targets when it's doing its monetary policy. And then the bottom one is a typical credit card rate, and so that's a little bit higher. So these different markets or types of loans have different rates, higher and lower, but they all move in kind of accordance with the federal funds rate. When the Fed targets that, that has an effect on the other rates go up or down based on that movement. Okay, so let's look at the money market, and this will show how interest rates are determined based on money supply and money demand. All right, so you can look at slides 5 to 7. Okay, so we're going to define the money market as demand is composed of two categories. So people want to hold money for this model for two reasons. So the first, and for money we just mean like this is like M1, have money as cash or in your checking account. So this is just money as the basic sense, the most liquid form of money, M1. Okay, so you might want to hold money, or you do want to hold money for transactions. There's a overall level of money demand just based on the number of transactions that the economy wants to make, and that's determined by the nominal GDP. So if GDP is up or down, if it's up, then that's more money per transactions. If it's less, then that's less money, probably like it is now. Okay, and you also have money as an asset, and that just means that it's just a store of, it's a financial asset that doesn't earn really any interest. But if there's still a lot of money in checking accounts or savings accounts and just in currency, and that's because it's a relatively risk-free asset. And so if returns are down in other markets, like in the stock market or the bond market or anything else, right? So the lower you can get in other markets, the more people want to hold money as an asset. And so this is indirectly related to interest rates. Because when interest rates are higher, you see less money demand because people put their money in things that earn higher interest rates, which makes sense. But when interest rates go low, or really low like they are now, then you see more people just put money in their checking account or savings account or just as cash because what's the point of putting money into an interest-bearing account if it doesn't earn much interest? So the lower the interest rates go, the more the asset demand for money goes up. All right, and those two things together comprise what we talk about as money demand. So you level the transactions demand and the asset demand make up this total demand. If we look at the next slide, all right, so this is transactions demand. So let's assume that in this example it's 100 billion. So that's determined by real GDP. Okay, so transactions demand is not determined by interest rates, it's just determined by how much GDP there is. But the asset demand varies inversely with interest rates for the reasons I just explained. The higher the interest rates go, less money is demanded because you prefer to put your money into something that earns interest rates. And if interest rates go low, then there's more money that people want because there's not much return with a lower interest rate. So you might as well have it in currency and checking accounts. So just think about like what's probably happening now and what happened during the financial crisis. So the economy lost a lot of money in risky assets, but in terms of like checking accounts, if you had your money in the checking account during the financial crisis, you most likely didn't lose anything because it's in your checking account. It's not dependent on the other risky assets. So checking accounts are very risk-free, and the lower you can earn on other risky investments, the more you're going to put your money in the checking account. All right, if we add those two together, right, so this is, see how this one starts at 100? The transactions demand, so you basically you're adding these two together. So we're starting at 100, then we're putting in this curve. So this is this. So this is no matter what, we need 100 billion for transactions in this example, and then depending on the interest rate, demand goes up or down. Okay, and then the intersection of the SM is the money supply. The intersection of that and the money demand determine the interest rate. So in this case, we have an interest rate of about 5% determined by the supply and demand or money market equilibrium. Okay, so what we're showing in this simple graph is that money demand in the economy is based on transactions demand and asset demand, and then money supply is indirectly controlled by the Federal Reserve. Okay, so everybody see what's going on in this money market graph? Okay. All right, so next slide is on the equilibrium interest rate. So moving from that money market or money supply, money demand graph. So the equilibrium interest rate is determined when the money supply shifts or the money demand shifts. So this intersection, right, you can see if money supply goes up, then interest rates would go down, and if money demand goes up, then interest rates would go up. So, okay. Okay, so if money supply goes up, so like there, you would see that if there's more money in the economy and then there's people less willing to borrow at higher interest rates, so money supply or interest rates go down. And if money demand goes up, that would say that people are willing to borrow at higher interest rates. So depending on what happens to shifts in money supply and money demand, that would change the interest rate accordingly. So the equilibrium interest rate is determined by the intersection of money supply and money demand. And if either of those things changes, in particular, if the money supply changes as a result of monetary policy, then that's going to change interest rates, which have a huge effect on the economy. And that's why we look at monetary policy through this little graph. Okay, and so we won't talk too much about bonds or bond prices, but we did mention bonds when we talked about mortgage-backed securities last time. And so just here, just notice that interest rates and bond prices are inversely related. And so this is because the bond, it pays you a fixed annual interest payment, right? and that is going to be relative. So the price of that bond is relative to what happens outside of the bond market. And so lower bond prices would raise the interest rate because if demand is lower for the bond, then that means you're getting a higher return in some other interest-bearing investment. And so I put a little section in the Word document on this. Okay, so I put a little paragraph and a little link to Investopedia about I think it's kind of interesting how it explains interest rates and bond prices, how there's an inverse relationship based on the nature of how bonds are structured. Okay, so here, hopefully this makes sense. What we're trying to tell you is that bonds have an inverse relationship between interest rates. And so when interest rates rise, the bond prices fall and vice versa. And so the way you can look at that is look at this example. So normally you buy a bond for a price, and then in some time it matures, so maybe it's 10 years. And so you buy it for a price, and then in 10 years you get the coupon value. And so normally, or always, the cash out value is higher than what you initially paid, but you also usually get a fixed payment along the way. That's the interest payment, which is preset. But if you look at a bond that has no interest payment, that'll explain why that bond prices and interest rates are inversely related. So here, easy way to grasp why bond prices move in the opposite direction of interest rates is to consider the zero coupon bonds. All right, so just assume that you don't get the coupon payments, you only get the cash out value. All right, so they don't pay coupons, but they derive their value from the difference between the purchase price and the par value paid at maturity. So basically, you buy it for cheaper, and then if you wait long enough, you get a higher cash out price. Okay, so if a zero coupon bond is $950, then its par value is 1,000. That means in 1 year. So that means the bond's rate of return for just this maturity thing is about 5%. So here's the difference between 950 and 1,000 in 1 year. And so that means that if you want to pay 150 for that bond, that must be better than what you can get in some other interest account. And so that should show you, if you look at the simple example with no coupon payments, that if you're going to wait a certain amount of time for the bond, then that is pretty much the interest rate. So if you're happy with a 5% return for this bond, then that means it must be better than, or at least equal to what you can get with an interest rate account. And if it's not, people would pay less for it. If people prefer this more, then they would bid up the price. So hopefully this shows why there's a clear negative relationship between interest rates and bonds, because the return at maturity determines the price of the bond. And if that return becomes more attractive, then people will bid up the price of the bond. And if it doesn't, they'll drop the price. And this all has to do with what happens in the interest rates and the other financial aspects of the economy. Okay, so hopefully that explains, it makes sense why interest rates and bond prices have a negative relationship there. Okay, so we introduced monetary policy, we talked about interest rates, we introduced the money market, and then we just side noted to show that you can talk more about bonds, but note that bonds have an inverse relationship with interest rates, so that's also like a side effect of what happens in monetary policy. Okay, so we're about to talk about all the tools of monetary policy. Everybody good so far with what we've talked about? Okay, good. So let's, this is the bulk of the chapter is setting up monetary policy. And so this is a very important aspect, and you can see that there's huge research and study on what's going on now with what the Federal Reserve is doing in relation to monetary policy. Okay, so let's introduce monetary policy on slides 8 through 13. Okay, and we're going to have, just like fiscal policy, you can have expansionary monetary policy, which would boost the economy, and you can also have restrictive if you want to fight inflation. Okay, let's look at the tools of monetary policy, starting on slide 8 and going through slides 8 to 13. Okay, so there's quite a few different tools. I think there's 5 total that are going to introduce. Yeah, there's technically, in this chapter, there's 5 tools and which the Fed can use to influence the economy. Now, the first one is usually the most important, so we'll talk about that one first. All right. So again, monetary policy is the Federal Reserve using its policy tools to try to influence the money supply, right? And so these are the ways the Fed can indirectly influence the money supply, and these things work usually pretty well, unless interest rates get really low, which they are now. So let's talk about this one first, because this is the most important. So open market operations are the biggest, the most widely used and most effective tool of monetary policy. That's why we looked at first. Okay, and so this is the mass or deliberate buying and selling of government bonds or securities. So this is when the Federal Reserve makes transactions with banks, and it can either buy these government securities or it can sell them to the banks. And so it works to the general banks, the commercial banks, and the general public. And this has a direct effect on the money supply because you can think of it both ways. So when the Fed sells securities, commercial bank reserves reduce. And so this is because if they have so a government security is just a treasury bond. So this is a government security, right? So all these bonds we talked about are just, you buy the bond and then it expires at a certain date and you get coupon payments, and then at the end, once it matures, you cash it out because the contract is over. So you basically let you loan the government money, pretty much this is how the government finances its debt, is by issuing government bonds. And so if you buy these bonds, they're usually pretty low interest rates, but they're risk-free because the government has to pay them back, right? And so the Federal Reserve moving these assets around serves no risk because these assets always hold value because they always get paid back. There's no risk of like default. Okay, so if they sell securities to banks, that means the banks are taking these securities and the Fed is taking the currency or the cash. So if the Fed takes the cash from the banks, that means that less money is going to be in the economy because the banks now have more securities, but they have less cash, right? So normally what they would do and what they're doing now in huge scale, so what the Federal Reserve is doing now to boost the economy is buying huge amounts of government securities from banks because the banks need money to lend to their customers in huge amounts right now. And so the way that those banks can get money is by the Fed buying all the securities they can, and therefore the banks get the money from the Fed, and the Fed just holds the reserves, the securities, right? So by buying the more government securities or bonds they buy from banks, the more money the banks get, then they can lend to their customers, and then the Fed doesn't really care because they still have the asset, which is a guaranteed bond. Okay, so to boost the economy or to boost the money supply, the Fed, first of all, can buy government securities. Okay, so that's the first and most effective tool of monetary policy, and this almost always works. And it's working now, but the problem is the economy needs more. Okay, so just before we move to the next thing, just think about how important this is right now, because so the government is issuing loans to all these companies that need them, and there's not enough. And so when the loans run out, which they have been doing, then what happens is the small businesses have to go to separate private banks to get loans, and that's what they're doing now. And the way that those private banks can make more loans is by the Federal Reserve giving them more money, and they do that by buying their securities. So this is a very effective way of getting banks more money, and then those banks can make loans to their customers in times of downturn, like it's happening now. Okay, so these are the other 4 tools, I guess. And so this is a relatively new one because the repos and reverse repos are what happens when the Federal Reserve needs to do something in addition to buying government securities. And so this is and I put a little section on the document we'll look at for this. Repos and reverse repos are the Federal Reserve basically buying more risky assets and holding it as collateral. And that way they can get the money back at a pre-specified date. So I put a little thing on repos and reverse repos in case you want to see that described here. All right, so we still have some more tools in monetary policy, but this is the slide now. So let's look at the repos and reverse repos strategy that the Fed can also use. So this is like I would say the repos and reverse repos are like a subdivision of open market operations. So this is like when buying government securities isn't effective enough and you have to do something else. This is like stage B, or, like 1A and 1B. So this is a form of open market operation. Okay, so I think this nicely explains repos and reverse repos, and there's another link to the Investopedia page. But so a repo is a repurchase agreement is the slang name is repo. Okay, so it's a form of short-term borrowing used in the money market, and it involves the purchase of securities with the agreement to sell them back at a specific date, usually for a higher price. All right, so the difference here is these are probably securities that are more risky, and so if the Fed wants to if the open market operations, like just buying government securities, doesn't give the banks enough money, what else they can do? Another thing they can do is buy more risky assets, right? And make a contract saying, we'll buy this from you, but you have to buy it back at this date, and then you have to buy it back for a higher price, so the Fed makes a higher return by buying a riskier asset. Okay, so repos and reverse repos are the same transaction basically, but they're titled differently depending on what side of the transaction you're on. Okay, so like it says here, the party originally selling the security and agreeing to the repurchase in the future, it's a repurchase agreement, right, or RP. So if you're selling the security, if you're the bank selling the security, then you're doing the repo. And for the party buying the security and agreeing to sell it back in the future, this is probably the Federal Reserve, then it's called a reverse repo. So it's the same transaction, but if you're selling it, then it's a repo. If you're buying it, it's a reverse repo. So usually it's the Fed. Now, if they're trying to get more money into banks, they're doing a bunch of reverse repos. Okay, so it's a loan, but the repurchase agreement involves the sale of an asset, and it's pretty much held as collateral until the seller repurchases it at a premium. So it's kind of like a form of buying government securities, but this has a preset buyback date, so that's why it's called a repurchase agreement, because you're agreeing to repurchase it, right? So if the Fed buys it, you're agreeing to repo it at a certain date. And if you don't repurchase it back, then your interest payment goes up, and the Federal Reserve would just hold that asset as collateral until you buy it back, like the agreement says. Okay, so this is a more newer strategy by the Fed, but in times of severe economic downturn, it needs to do this because if interest rates are low, a lot of times just buying government securities isn't enough, and they can do this as well. So they can buy these assets and agree to sell them back at the specified date, and then they have the asset as collateral. Okay, back to slides 14 and 17. So we're still talking about the tools of monetary policy. We're still up here, slides 8 to 13. So let's go to the next tool. We talked about two of them. All right. So we talked about buying government securities. We talked about reverse repos. Okay, another policy tool that's less effective, but it can still be used, is remember when we did last time, we did the money multiplier reserve ratio examples, and I think you did one in your homework. So if the Fed changes the reserve ratio, they indirectly change the money supply, right? Because if the Fed lowers the reserve ratio, that means the banks have to keep less in the vault or with the Fed, and therefore they have more money. So if the Fed lowers what they have to keep on reserve, then the banks can lend out more, and if they increase it, then the banks have less to lend out. So another way to increase the money supply is to lower the reserve ratio, so that gives the banks the flexibility to make more loans. Okay, another tool is the discount rate, and the discount rate is the Fed as a lender of last resort, and this is for short-term loans. So this is if the banks have to borrow money from the Federal Reserve, they have to pay this rate. Okay. So if they have to, they can borrow money directly from the Fed instead of doing these, agreements and selling government securities. If banks need money tonight, like we call these overnight loans, they can borrow money at this discount rate, and so you can see how the Fed can control the money supply with this tool. All right, so if they lower the discount rate, that would make it cheaper for the banks to borrow, and then the banks in the margin would borrow more money, so that would increase the money supply, right? So a lower cost of borrowing would give the banks more money to lend, and so this is another way the Fed can get more money into the economy, is to lower the cost of borrowing, the discount rate, and that would pump up the money supply because that would allow banks to make additional borrows and to lend more money to the economy. All right, and the last tool here is the interest on reserves, and this is exactly what it seems. This is the interest rate that the Fed pays banks to keep excess reserves with the Fed. All right, so if you leave extra money, if you just have extra money on reserves with the Federal Reserve, they'll pay you interest on that. And so the more you just leave with the Fed and don't use, just in case of emergency, they'll pay you interest rates. They'll pay you interest on keeping it, just like a savings account. So this is like a big bank savings account. Is if they don't want to do anything risky, they can just leave their money in the Federal Reserve, which is like a giant savings account. Okay, but the way this controls the money supply is if the Fed lowers the interest on reserves, you can see that that would make it less profitable for them to keep money with the Fed, and they take out more money and lend it to their customers. So lowering the interest rate on reserves would make banks use more in lending and not keep it with the Fed because the lower the interest rate is with the Federal Reserve as a savings account, then the higher the chances they'll just make more loans because like if it went down to 0%, there's no reason to hold it there, and they might as well make loans. So another way the Fed can increase the money supply is lower interest on reserves. Okay, so we just covered a lot of things, and let me write in the chat the 5 ways the Fed can, that we've talked about now, increase the money supply. Okay, so I think that summarizes so this would be like expansionary monetary policy. Okay, so the Fed can first buy government securities, okay, or they can do reverse repos, which is to buy the more risky assets from the banks and agree when they agree to purchase them back. Lower the reserve ratio, lower discount rates, lower interest on reserves. Any of these strategies or a combination of more than one would, in theory, increase the money supply and lower interest rates, which we'll see in the money market. All right, so do we see how all these things would boost the money supply? Okay, so All right, this slide just shows how the reserve ratio can affect the money supply, and we pretty much did this in last week's homework assignment. But you can see here that if the Fed increases the reserve ratio, then banks have less to lend, and therefore the money supply goes down. So there's a negative relationship, which you already know, between the reserve ratio and money creating potential. So the higher the reserve ratio, the lower the multiplier. Okay, so normally, like in times of current, if there is monetary policy, it's normally expansionary, unless we have inflation as an issue. But if there's a recession or unemployment, or likely both, which could be the current situation, then the Fed can use any of those five things to increase the money supply. So expansionary monetary policy is any of the five tools that I just listed, and this is the most widely used, but the other ones are nice too. Okay, so they're definitely doing that, but the other things can also be used. Okay, and then if there's a problem of inflation, if the Fed wants to just slow down prices or stop inflation, they could use restrictive monetary policy, and the way to do that is to do the opposite of what I said for expansionary. So if they do the opposite of any of those five things, that would decrease the money supply. So sell government securities, repos, increase the reserve ratio, increase the discount rate, or increase interest on reserves. Any of those things would be a form of restrictive monetary policy, and that would be used if the economy has a problem of inflation, and you don't want inflation to get out of control. Okay, so we just talked about the five tools, or five important tools, both expansionary and restrictive monetary policy. And so these are very important things for this chapter, because they help you illustrate the effectiveness of monetary policy. Okay, so any questions? Everybody good so far? Any questions on any of the types or effects of monetary policy? Okay, so we talked about repos and reverse repos as a tool of monetary policy, so we did that. Okay, so next thing is monetary policy and how it affects GDP through kind of a three-part graph. So let's look at slides 14 to 17, because this shows the graphical analysis of how monetary policy would affect the GDP and the economy. So let's look at the graphical analysis of monetary policy starting on slide 14. Okay, so there's going to be an effect on real GDP through this kind of cause and effect chain. So we're going to look at what happens first in the money market. Okay, then what happens in the money market is going to affect investment. and that's going to affect aggregate demand, and then that's going to affect GDP. So it's kind of a chain reaction when the Fed does something and has an influence on the money supply. Okay, so in this graphical analysis, you can show expansionary or contractionary monetary policy through the money market, the investment demand curve, and then that goes into the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model that we looked at in one of those chapters, maybe chapter 13. Okay, so I tried to make it full screen because it was kind of small. Can you guys see the full screen? Okay, so once it stops doing its thing, I'll explain it. Okay, so we're basically showing the effectiveness graphically of monetary policy. Let's just start at SM1. So this is the supply of money number one. All right, so we're over here at a 10% interest rate, and 125 is our money supply. Okay, so at a 10% interest rate, this is the level of investment, and then this is the original. Q1 is the original. That's where we start with our Q1. So we're in a recession. Right? So we're starting at Q1 over in the panel C. Okay, so we're trying to show how expansionary monetary policy can boost aggregate demand and then increase GDP, all right, to try to get the economy out of the recession. Okay, so if the Fed does any of those five things, which would increase the money supply, you can see that the money supply curve would shift to SM2, right, and the new intersection is an interest rate of 8%. So increasing the money supply lowers the interest rate, okay, because if there's more money in the economy, then that means that the amount that we're just going down the money demand curve, right? And so if there's more money, then the interest rate you'll borrow money at has got to be lower because there's already enough to go around. Right? The economy has more money, so the chances that they'll pay the higher interest rate to borrow it are lower. So we get a lower interest rate. And if you look at panel B, the investment demand curve, when the money supply increases and interest rates go down, that means there's more investment because it's now cheaper for firms to borrow, right? So if it's cheaper to borrow, they borrow and invest more. Okay, investing more would increase the I thing in the GDP equation. Okay, and then that would increase or shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. Okay, and then the same thing would happen if we increase the money supply more. So what happens in this, hopefully this three-panel exercise makes sense, that every time the Fed increases the money supply, that pushes the interest rate down, which increases investment. And increasing investment means that there's more investment spending, and that automatically means that the the GDP equation that was C plus I plus G plus X, the I goes up because there's more investment spending. And if that's the case, that's equivalent to an increase in aggregate demand. All right, and then we get to a newer and higher level of GDP. Okay, so the Fed can, in theory, control the money supply, which lowers interest rates if they increase it, which increases investment, that increases aggregate demand, and that increases equilibrium GDP. Okay, so hopefully this, you can see how this ties back into the AS/AD curve, the investment demand curve. And this is, the full graphical analysis of monetary policy. And normally, if I had a whiteboard, I would do this whole thing on the whiteboard, and you guys would probably have a homework question on it. But because of the limitations, I just want you guys to learn it, and you don't have to learn the graph. And so you don't have to reproduce this analysis on your homework or the exam, but I do want you guys to understand how the graphical analysis works. Okay, so questions on this? All right, are you happy to have to draw this on an in-class exam? Okay. Yeah, it is I think it's kind of fun, but it does get well, okay, then there's a few more slides that explain the kind of cause and effect chain that happens with the expansionary or restrictive monetary policy. And so next slide was, after the graph, there's slide 16, which shows the cause and effect chain from expansionary monetary. So this is just explaining what we showed on the graph in words. Okay, so if we have unemployment or recession, the Fed would want to use one of those tools to conduct expansionary monetary policy. So they're going to buy bonds, lower the reserve ratio, lower the discount rate, or reverse repos, or lower interest on reserves. Right? There's two more things they can do. And if they do that, there's going to be more excess reserves because the banks have more money to lend to their customers. That's going to cause the federal funds rate to fall, which is the rate that money for banks lend to each other at. So we'll introduce the federal funds rate, but this is the rate the Fed's target, and you can see why. So if the federal funds rate goes down, this leads to the money supply going up because the banks have more money to lend to their customers. And as we saw in the graph, interest rates go down with the increase in the money supply. That leads to more investment because if the interest rate's lower, the cost of investing drops. So there's more private investment. That boosts aggregate demand, and we know that that's a shift in the AD curve, and then we get a new higher real GDP. Okay, and this explains the other direction. If you wanted to combat or stop inflation, you can use the restrictive, and this is the complete opposite chain reaction. Right? You can sell bonds. The Fed can increase reserve ratio, increase discount rate, and they could do repos, or they could do raise interest on reserves. Any of those things are restrictive monetary policy. Okay, that's going to decrease reserves, increase the federal funds rate, and that's going to cause the money supply to go in the other direction, which is going to increase the interest rate. With the higher interest rates, there's less investment because it's too costly to borrow. The AD curve shifts to the left, and you get a halt or decline in inflation. So this would be like going the other direction if you look here. Okay, so if you went from left to right, you can illustrate the restrictive monetary policy. Okay, so hopefully we get a pretty good idea of what tools the Fed has to influence the money supply, and hopefully you see that by doing that, that affects interest rates, and interest rates affect investment, and then that's what shifts the AD curve, and that leads to higher or lower real GDP levels. And so the Fed has a lot of power in influence the money supply. And so that's how they do all this stuff, is by influencing investment, by controlling the money supply. Okay, so let's briefly talk about the federal funds rate and the prime interest rate on slides 19 and 20. Okay, so the federal funds rate is the rate banks charge each other on overnight loans. So this is, if you're a bank and you need money tonight, you can make a loan, or you can get a loan from another bank at this federal funds rate. Okay, and this is the rate at which the Fed targets through its monetary policy. So this is the first thing that happens, is when they do their expansionary or contractionary monetary policy, that indirectly and almost always changes the federal funds rate. And so if the federal funds rate changes, goes up or down, that's what affects all the other things. Okay, so this is what they're targeting when they're giving out or taking back money from the economy. Okay, so this is what the Fed targets, and this is the rate that, again, that each banks charge each other if you need an overnight loan. So if you need an immediate loan, you have to go to this, or borrow from this federal funds rate. Okay, and you can see how here's the prime interest rate, and this is the rate, this is like the baseline for banks making loans to other customers. And so you can see that the prime interest rate is always a little bit higher, but it kind of moves along with the federal funds rate. So this is a really good analysis or graphical illustration of how the prime interest rate is higher, but you can clearly see that whatever happens to the federal funds rate, the prime interest rate moves along with it. So the Fed can control all the interest rates in the economy by targeting the federal funds rate. Okay, so the federal funds rate again is just interest on overnight loans between banks, and the prime interest rate is the interest rate used as a reference point for a wide range of bank loans. So if this is the rate at which, if you want a bank loan and you're really good, or not really good, but you have a good credit score and you have the bank trusts you in making a loan, this is probably the best loan you can get, is the prime interest rate. So if you look, you can look at the historical data. I have a link here. Okay, so this is the federal funds rate, the rate that the Fed targets from 1954 to now, and so you can see it's after the most recent recession, the financial crisis, the Fed purposely targeted a lower rate and kept it very low. So for almost 5 years, from 2000 to 2005 or so, it was pretty much zero. And then to encourage other investments, the Fed targeted a higher rate. But now you can see that this is March 2020. The federal funds rate is back to around zero because the Fed is trying to encourage investment at really low rates. Not really sure if it's working, but the problem is here that the Fed is running out of flexibility because if their monetary policy goal is to reduce interest rates, and they're already pretty close to zero, then monetary policy becomes very ineffective in its general form. So currently interest rates are very low, and we tried to raise them again, and we did, or the Fed did, not we, but now given the state of the economy, they've been targeted to lower rates, and so right now it's pretty much 0%. Okay, and we can also look at the prime interest rate on the same database. Okay, and you can clearly see that this moves a lot, like if you look at both of these pictures, this one's a little bit higher, but it's clear that they move together. So whatever happens to the Fed's targeted rate, the federal funds rate, that has an indirect effect on what happens to all the interest rates in the economy. So it's likely that all those interest rates are low. So if you want to get a home loan right now, they're pretty low. If you want to get a car loan, they're pretty low. The problem is that not a lot of people can make investments in cars or houses right now because of the state of the economy. All right, so the prime interest rate as of April 2020 from now is about 3%, so that's really, really low for the prime interest rate. It's normally at least about 5%, and a prime interest rate of 3% is super low, which means that interest rates in the economy are going to be pretty low right now. Okay, so I mean, the good news is if you need a loan, all the interest rates are low. But the problem is there's no money to be lent out. Okay, let's talk about the last couple of slides in this PowerPoint. So recent monetary policy from slides 21 to 22. Okay, so given the response of the Federal Reserve after the recession around 2000, the much bigger recession in 2008, 2009, and now the Federal Reserve has been, and monetary policy has been very active. Okay, they responded pretty quick, whether you agree with their decision or not, to get lots of money into the big banks by conducting huge amounts of monetary policy. And the problem is this can be a criticism now, is the critics say the Fed contributed to the crisis by keeping interest rates low, which could be true. And the problem is, again, happening where if the goal of monetary policy is to push interest rates down, if they're already around zero, then it's hard to do that. Okay, and then just a few problems that could arise with monetary policy is there's lags, which means that it takes time to recognize that you're in a recession. I mean, right now it didn't take too long to recognize. This means that that actually all policy might contribute or play a role in actually causing the business cycle. So it could be that when the policy measures they push too much and actually cause the business cycle. And in this one is I have a little section on the liquidity trap because this is the fact that this is a problem when the federal funds rate is really low and close to zero, which is obviously a problem right now. Okay, so the last couple things in the key concepts is if there's a liquidity trap, which we'll describe, then the Fed might have to do other things to boost the economy, such as quantitative easing, which it did during the financial crisis, and probably is going to have to do now. So let's define the liquidity trap concept. Okay, so this is a problem if the interest rates are low, which they are now. So if someone asks you about what you think about interest rates, you can explain the liquidity trap because interest rates are super low. And so it's a contradictory situation in which interest rates are very low and savings rates are high. And so that, in theory, makes the monetary policy we're talking about pretty ineffective if interest rates can't be pushed any lower. So this was introduced by John Maynard Keynes, a famous economist. And so during a liquidity trap, consumers choose to avoid bonds and keep their funds in cash savings because of the prevailing belief that interest rates could soon rise. So this is which would push the bond prices down. So what would happen is instead of putting your money into government bonds that earn pretty much no interest, you might as well keep your money in a savings account and wait till the interest rates go back up and then put your money into those bonds which are higher interest rates. So if there's very little to no return in the bond market, then you might as well just keep your money in cash and wait till there is a return. Okay, and so like we said, because the bonds have an inverse relationship between interest rates and bond prices, that consumers don't want to hold an asset with the price that's expected to decline. So if you have a bond that earns no interest and bond prices pay a higher interest in a year from now, then your bond is not worth much. And at the same time, the central bank efforts to spur the economy are hampered because they can't lower interest rates any further because people are just holding cash. So this is really a problem now where interest rates are super low and people don't want to put their money into a bond market that pays no interest, and they might as well just hold the money in their checking account and wait until there's a better bond market. And this is a clear problem because the Federal Reserve it's going to be difficult for them to push the interest rates down any further if they're already about zero. Okay, and then quantitative easing is kind of a response. So if traditional monetary policy doesn't work, you can try this, which the Fed did during the financial crisis and is going to be doing now. So quantitative easing is a form of unconventional monetary policy in which banks purchase longer-term securities from the open market to increase the money supply and encourage lending and investment. So buying the securities adds new money into the economy and also helps to lower interest rates, which doesn't really help now because they're already low, by bidding up fixed income securities. And so when shorter-term securities are either approaching zero, which they are now, then normal open market operations, which are supposed to target the federal funds rate, don't do anything because the federal funds rate is zero. Okay, so instead the Fed has to target longer term or more risky assets in their open market operation. Okay, and then this was very effective during the financial crisis because you can probably guess what they bought instead of, so if lowering the interest rates didn't work and the other assets that were failing didn't help anybody else, they had to buy those assets, and the assets that caused the most recent financial crisis were those mortgage-backed securities. So what the Fed did is just buy a bunch of those and keep them until they were worth something. Okay, so it usually involves the central bank purchasing longer-term assets as well as other types of assets such as mortgage-backed securities because nobody else wanted them, so the Fed bought them and waited until they were worth something. So this is what they did. So here's what it says now. Okay, so yeah, here's what the Fed is planning to do or has already done now is in response to the economic shutdown, the current state, the COVID-19 pandemic, just a few weeks ago, or I guess a month ago or less, the Federal Reserve announced a quantitative easing program that amounted to over 700 billion. So they think of new things in which they can buy assets from other banks that would prefer to have cash to give to their customers. And so instead of just buying the risk-free government securities, which they prefer to do, they have to buy longer-term assets or more risky assets, such as mortgage-backed securities, or any way they can buy something and give money to the banks without losing that money. So they still have the asset, and the banks get the money. And the problem is, and this is what the Fed is doing now. Okay. So I introduced a lot of techniques and tools that the Fed can use, but hopefully you guys get a good idea of what the Fed can do and is doing now, given the state of the economy. So you can see how some of these things can work in normal times, but then in critical times like now, the Fed has to do things like reverse repos and quantitative easing, which I guess this could be a sixth type of monetary policy, but this is really just this is like a subset of open market operation. Okay, questions on any of this stuff so far? Okay, well, just if you could explain the liquidity traps and quantitative easing to your parents or your friends, they'll sound really smart. So make sure you can explain these things because they're really relevant to the current situation. All right, so there's some optional videos. There's one on the same channel that has all those economic channels for monetary policy, which is nice. There's one on quantitative easing. There's one on liquidity traps. So if you want to look a little more on either of those topics, then click on some of those videos. Okay. So they explain monetary policy, interest rates, and bond prices, repos and reverse repos, liquidity traps, quantitative easing. And now we have a few examples to do here. Okay, so just give me 30 seconds to fill up my coffee, and we'll start the examples in just a second. Okay, number one. All right, let's look at the table here for some hypothetical moolah economy, and let's answer the question. So we have a chart of money supply, money demand, interest rates, investment, potential GDP, and then actual GDP. So potential GDP is like full employment GDP that we looked at in the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. Okay, point A. What is the equilibrium interest rate in moolah? And I'm going to make little I the interest rate, so you can see that if you look at the chart, the only situation in which money supply and money demand are equal is here. Here they're both 500, and then that's the result of the equilibrium rate, which is 5%. Okay, and then part B, what is the level of investment at the equilibrium interest rate? And so big I is investment, and you can see that at that equilibrium, when money supply equals money demand, the interest rate is 5 and investment is 20. Okay, and then is there either a recessionary output gap, which would be negative GDP, like they're below potential, or inflationary output gap, which means there's too much inflation and they're above potential, or at the equilibrium interest rate, and if either, what is the amount? So then we have a gap, and you can see that if you stick in the same row, money supply equals money demand, here's the interest rate of 5%, here's the investment of 20, our potential is 350, but we're only at 330, so we're short, we're falling short of potential by 20, so there's a recessionary gap, we're below potential at a difference of 20. Okay, there's a recessionary output gap of 20. Okay, part D, given money demand, how much would the Mueller central bank need to change the money supply to close the output gap? All right, and so look over here, where's the place where actual GDP equals potential? That's here, where 350 is 350. And if you go along that row, here, so investment would be 30, and that would be a 4% interest rate. Okay, and so that would be a money demand of 600. And so this would be equivalent to expansionary monetary policy of boosting the money supply by 100. So if this money supply came up to 600, then we'd have a new equilibrium at 600, an interest rate of 4%, and that would close the output gap. So we're just saying the Fed would have to boost or increase the money supply by 100 to close that output gap and bring the equilibrium interest rate to 4%. Okay, so the Mueller central bank would need to increase the money supply by 100 to close the output gap. All right, so part E, last part of this question is what is the expenditure multiplier in Mueller? There was the multiplier from chapter 13, I think, was the multiplier effect on spending on GDP. So the general equation was the change in GDP divided by the change in spending. Remember that? So the multiplier is the change in real GDP divided by the change in spending. And in this case, the spending for monetary policy is investment spending. Okay, remember that's how their monetary policy goes to hit the interest rates, which boosts investment. So here's the equation. So what are the changes in real GDP? If you look at the far right column, okay, so every time GDP changes, it changes by 20, right? So plus 20, plus 20, plus 20. So those are changes in 20. And what is investment changing by? Increments of 10, 10, 20, 30, 40. So you can see that when the spending changes by 10, this GDP changes by 20, right? So that's a multiplier. 20 divided by 10, which is exactly 2. Okay, so this change in spending is being doubled, and each of these 10-point changes leads to a 20-point change in GDP, so that's a multiplier of 2. Okay, so questions on this one? Okay, number 2, which again, this, in normal times, this would be a whiteboard analysis and probably a test question, but for now, I just want you guys to understand the graphs and the cause-effect chain. So, number 2, let's show the effect of expansionary monetary policy using the following diagrams. We'll start with the money market, money supply and money demand. Then that goes to the investment demand market, and then that affects aggregate demand, which affects real GDP. All right, so this is just the same graph that you saw on the slide, but this is a good way of showing, and I want you guys to understand this, that every time there's expansionary monetary policy, that increases the money supply. And channel A, which pushes down the interest rates, which boosts investment. All right, and again, boosting investment would increase the aggregate demand curve, and so it shifts to the right. And every time it shifts to the right, you get a higher equilibrium GDP. Okay, so hopefully the graphical analysis is clear, even though we won't be touching on it, but I do want you guys to know how all these graphs work and how the money market affects the investment demand market, and then that ties back into the ABAS model. Okay, so any questions on this? Okay, well, you won't be required to draw this, but you could, right, if you had to? Okay, I believe you. If you're ever on like some kind of challenge show where the challenge is like illustrate, expansionary monetary policy, I expect that you guys should be able to do it. Okay. Okay, so that finishes up the study guide for chapter 15. So again, look at all the key definitions and videos if you want more on any of those topics. So the first question, how did I get part D? Oh, okay. So we're currently at this row, right? 500, 505, 20, 350, 330, and we're below our potential. We're at 330, and we want to be at 350. And the only way we're going to be at 350 is this row, right? So they're both our actual equals our potential. So that's like saying we're at our full employment, and that's a situation in which interest rates are 4%. All right. So the only way to make interest rates 4% is to boost the money supply and make a higher money supply equal to the money demand at 600. So we need to add 100 to this, which would make both of these 600. So if this goes up by 100, then these two are both 600, and that would be equal to this new equilibrium at 4%. So basically, if you add 100 to all the money supplies, then what's the new equilibrium? It's this one here, where it's 600 equals 600, and then we're at the 4% interest rate if we close the outside cap. You see that? Okay, you're welcome. Yeah, it's a little. I'm not sure if I like this. Sometimes I like this problem, sometimes I don't. It helps illustrate the example, but yeah, it's a little. The wording is a little bit. Yeah. Okay, so let's just look at the homework assignment for chapter 15. This is your last homework assignment. So after tonight, I'll never assign you another homework, except for the final exam, I guess. Okay, so the last homework is just kind of a very it's not a very quantitative assignment. It's more of just explaining what we learned in monetary and fiscal policy. So it's just kind of a short answer, one question. Okay, part A is just you're going to list the two issues that we keep talking about that would require the use of expansionary policy, whether it's fiscal or monetary. So what are the two situations in which we need to boost the economy? And then what's the main issue that would require the use of contractionary policy? So what's the economic issue that we need to slow down the economy and contract? Okay, and then part B is we discussed two tools that the U.S. government has to conduct expansionary fiscal policy. And all you got to do here is list and describe how each policy tool would lead to an increase in GDP in 1 to 2 sentences each. And you can use the equation for calculating GDP if you want, which is the GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X equation. All right, and in part C, we just did this. We discussed 5 tools that the Fed has to conduct expansionary monetary policy. So you just need to list each of those things and list and describe how each of those policy tools would boost GDP in 1 to 2 sentences each. And if you need to use the GDP equation, you can use that because this is going to go through the investment spending. All right, and so no one needs to put the graphs, so no graphs are needed here. Just explain how fiscal policy, all the ways in which they can basically use expansionary policy, and all the ways we talked about for expansionary fiscal and expansionary monetary, and that's it for this little discussion here. Okay, so any questions on what you need to do here for this assignment? All right, so no math, no graphs. Okay, okay, all right. So just I listed the 5 things for expansionary monetary policy. You still have to explain them, but you'll notice that there's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 you see that I put up in the chat. I'd recommend keep making a note of those. Just write those down in case you forget. Okay, and when you're done with this one, that goes right here, and that's going to be your last homework assignment. So once you finish this one, the only thing you have left is the final exam. And again, make sure you get all the homework got to be in by the last day of Wednesday, May 20th. That's the very last deadline, and you guys have plenty of time before then. But all right, everybody good on all the homework assignments that we've done since the midterm? So 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Anybody have any issues with any of those assignments? Okay, so we're about to wrap it up. So we have a couple more meetings. Next meeting, we'll do make sure you come next. I mean, you guys come every time, but next time we'll do the review for the final. And then I'll post the final on Blackboard, just like midterm too. So you have a week to do that. And then the last meeting will be Wednesday the 16th, or Wednesday, May 25th. Monday, May 25th. Okay, and again, nothing new that day. I'll just hold the last session in case you have any issues or questions about anything for the class. But everything is due, or the final is due that day. Okay, so that's all I have for tonight. And I'll see you guys next time, the same time, and we'll talk about we'll do reviews of all the macro stuff. I'll pass up the final, and let me know if you have any questions about the midterm, or not the midterm, but the homework or anything like that. But other than that, we're all good for tonight. So thank you guys for coming, and please stay safe. And we'll see you guys in a week. Thank you.